just like clockwork, just as the year ends for 2022, we get another one of these big updates for Automobilista 2. They always seem to come just a little bit later than expected and maybe including a few less things than they were supposed to, but these big releases that they're doing are very much appreciated. This one specifically, the 1.4.5.2 patch, it includes all the things that you'd expect in a patch, lots of bug fixes and physics changes and all this stuff, but it of course includes some new content, and that's really what's been most interesting with all these releases that AMS has done. The oval releases last year, some of the historic tracks like Spa and things. And now finally we're getting what I think the main part of this is, the Brazilian racing legends. This kind of came out of nowhere, at least for me. I'm sure they mentioned it at some point, but this is a pack that Reiza has put together to honor and enjoy, I guess, the Formula One champions of the past from Brazil. The country has drivers that have won many Grand Prix, achieved many podiums, and overall 8 Formula One World Championships. So this pack is a release of cars to really help expand and enjoy those Formula One Championship seasons of Brazilian drivers. But in reality, what it gives us is a great spanning range of Formula One seasons all the way from the 70s through the 80s and into the 90s. With some real cars, yes, but also some fictional cars to help fill in the grids. And with the large roster of 80s and 90s circuits, you can really experience some great racing from a wide range of seasons and give yourself a sense of that technological progression of the Grand Prix car. So I sat down today and wanted to test drive some of these new Formula One cars and get a sense of what they're like, and I thought I'd take you with me. I'd love to do a full in-depth review and race and everything of all of these cars, but I know myself and I probably won't get to all of them. But I'm very interested to see how different these cars can really be. The cars themselves are quite different, even though they come from a pretty tight range of years. The regulations in Formula One for engines and aerodynamics and everything changed dramatically over those years and evolved from really being an open style formula to the more restricted type rule set we have these days. So there should be a pretty remarkable change in cars as you go through each of them, and it could be fun to try each of them in order and see really what the differences are that pop out in just a few laps. So the pack itself is a complement to some of the content that's already in AMS2, and I guess you could start with the Lotus 49C, which has been in AMS2 since the release, I believe. And this would have been the car that Emerson Fittipaldi got his start in. And then the Lotus 72, which is a part of the retro Gen 1 pack that I've taken a look at in the past. It was Emerson's 1972 championship winning car. Or maybe the next model after that, but meant to represent that 72 that was so famous with Ronnie Peterson and himself. And part of that same set, the McLaren M4 that Emerson drove to that 74 championship. So Emerson Fittipaldi already covered and included with the cars of his 2 championships, and I'd love to see some of Emerson's later seasons in the Copper Sucar cars and some of the odd stuff. I think there were some of those in AMS1. But I've already driven these before and they've been in AMS for quite a while, so we'll skip over these and get to some of the cars included with this pack. So overall, this pack includes 5 additional cars to help fill out those 6 additional World Championships that Brazilian drivers have run, and those split of course between Nelson Piquet and Ayrton Senna. So interestingly enough, they're not the 6 cars that won the championships. Most of them are included, but I think this is actually a good thing, and we'll take a look through each of them specifically. But it creates a little bit more interesting of a set of cars, I think. And the first one is the BT49, the 1981 title winner that Nelson Piquet drove. And it's a part of the Formula Retro Gen 2 set, which is becoming a pretty interesting set of cars. It's all the late 70s, early 80s, so 78, 79, 80 timeframe cars. Includes 2 Brabhams, which is quite odd, but it includes the fan car, the BT46, which was so far and ahead of everything else with the fan at the rear that it really was much faster and could fit in with this group of cars. But the new BT49 does include a generic kind of shadow looking type model, as well as the Lotus 79. But the BT49 itself was in service from 79 through 82. F1 cars used to last quite a few seasons, and Reiza have chosen to model the 1980 version of this car, and I understand the 81 version was slightly different, that Piquet won his title in. But I think they chose this version to just help it fit this set of cars a little bit better. So this is ground effect era, but naturally aspirated. It was just, turbos were just starting to appear with the Renault. And so it's full side skirts, but naturally aspirated, so it shouldn't be so tricky to drive, at least in the throttle department. But still quite a basic car overall. Really, it was just aero that had evolved from the 60s and 70s. And they were still running that same Cosworth DFE engine that the Lotus 49 debuted in 1967. It was, of course, tuned over the years and produced more horsepower. But the same basic design, that engine ruled the 1970s. But this car itself proved superior, and I think won 3 races in both 1980 and 1981 and secured Piquet the title. Alright, so rolling out of the pits here at Silverstone in the BT49, and Silverstone I probably should have picked a Brazilian track, but I always like testing Formula One cars at Silverstone for some reason. It obviously is a place that a lot of cars were tested over the years. And specifically on the 1991 version of the circuit, which I quite like a lot, remember quite fondly from the Crammond sims in this layout. So the track would have been a lot different for this car, but I'm going to keep it the same for all the cars, and don't exactly want to do a hot lap competition or anything, because I really just want to experience these cars a little bit. So we'll get it up to 5th gear here down Hanger Straight, but default setups, and just see how they drive, and more importantly compare the cars a bit to understand maybe how the technology obviously changed over the years and how well that comes across here in AMS2. So out of the pits, we got the great sound of the V8 DFE behind me. And I'll give it a few laps here to get warmed up and then rejoin you once I've got my bearings. Alright, so we'll coax this car through the last few corners, and it's quite a lumbering car here on some of the slower stuff, but really livens up over a few fast corners. I've done a handful of laps now as we'll come across the line, and this is not meant to be some kind of record lap, but hop the curb there through cops. A lot of parallels to something like the Lotus 79, of which it was a contemporary or probably inspired by quite a bit. We'll get it down the gearbox, down a 2nd gear here through Maggots and Beckett's, and accelerate away onto the Hanger Straight, up the gears. Very fast car, love the engine note, and it feels like you're in this little cell of a cockpit, really high sides, and I think that's one thing we'll notice through a few of the cars. It's down to 2nd gear for Stowe. 3rd's probably a bit better through there. Come to this awkward chicane here at Club Corner. 2nd gear. The curbs on this version of the track are a bit dangerous as we slid a little bit. You can see some skid marks for myself spinning out over there earlier. Not so hard on the throttle though. Not sure the exact horse number figure on this. I'll put a little note on the screen, but it can't be much higher than 600-700, I'd imagine. Down to 2nd gear for, I think, Priory Corner here. Bit of a slide there. Slides are tough though, and that's something true with ground effects cars, as we'll get a good one there. Especially in faster corners, you basically have grip until you don't have it anymore. Not quite as progressive, but that was actually quite nice there through the end of the lap. I'll go for one more. Up the gearbox, 5th gear. H pattern in all of these cars, I believe. We'll make sure to check that before driving H, but I believe they're all H pattern. And clutch, although some could be shifted without the clutch, you most certainly would do it in a full Grand Prix to preserve the gearbox, preserve the engine. Hanger Straight once again, a bit better through Maggots and Beckett's that time. 5th gear then. We'll see if I can stick it through 3rd here through Stowe. A little bit of a narrow line, but get on the throttle and help turn the car. Wow, really springs sideways. It's one thing I've noticed in AMS2, the suspension really livens up, so I'll run a bit wide into club and get very slidey here. The car is essentially sliding the whole time there, which is a bit odd. but not unpleasant. And it's something I've found in AMS2. You can really use the throttle for turning some of these older cars. I wouldn't expect it quite as much in this car since it is a ground effect downforce style car, but you can still turn it quite well on the throttle, as we'll see here through the end of the lap. Too bad. Potential lap of a 1:35.6. That last lap wasn't so great through the end of it. A fun car to drive, though. It's an interesting one. I don't think I would ever choose this car over something like the 79 or the 46, the outrageous fan car. Seems a bit more interesting, and I quite like the Shadow imitation generic car that's a part of this set, but it's fun to drive this one and get a little bit of a feeling what it's like and compare the two, and certainly doesn't drive poorly. So a fun start to the pack, but we'll go ahead and see what's next. I mentioned light on the throttle with the BT49, and I expect this one to be very, very different. This is the BT52, the 1983 title winner for Piquet. And what you're seeing looks so drastically different. You could hardly expect it's just a few years of progression, but essentially, I believe in 1982, ground effects were banned, and a lot of cars started adopting this type of design, but none more extreme than the BT52. So gone were the needless side pods that created all that downforce, and back to more of that cylindrical shaped car, and more of a rocket ship, honestly. And it was certainly a rocket ship. Over 1,400 horsepower, that's right, 1,400 horsepower was said to be output from this BMW 4-cylinder engine. Just 4 cylinders, 1,400 horsepower thanks to turbocharging. But that was on the dyno. In reality, in qualifying, it probably only produced 1,200 horsepower or so, and in the race, significantly less than that. But it was still an insanely powerful car. And so in 1983, Piquet won 3 Grand Prix with it, the opening round in Brazil at Chicarapagua, and then the Italian Grand Prix and the European Grand Prix at Brands Hatch to end the season. A truly wild design, and one I'm really excited to try out, because I don't think this car's been modeled in too many ways before, certainly with some third-party mods, but this might be the first time it's appeared as a first-party addition to a sim. Sitting here in the pit lane before we go out, and I love the cockpit design for the 52 here. It somehow looks a bit more retro than the BT49, although it's a newer car, I guess. But love the analog gauges like it has. And listen to that 4-cylinder crank. All right, see if I can pull away. I've had problems stalling the car a few times already, and we'll roll out of the pits here and try a lap. Come onto the track here, and so I'm using, for all these cars, I think I mentioned, the default settings. So there's a lot to be done to play with different settings and things, and feel out the cars. And that's all to say, I don't exactly know how many horsepower we're playing with here, but I can already tell at a quarter throttle, as I'll roll through Maggots and Beckett's here, that we've got quite a lot of horsepower on board, and it feels very nimble. See if I can get the throttle down here on hanger straight up to 4th gear here. To 5th. Actually feels a little bit more tame than I was thinking it would. We'll come to the corner. I'm expecting the car to maybe understeer quite a bit. Just the shape of it would suggest that, as power comes on awful quick there. Down to 2nd for Chapel. And now we're playing with turbo boost, and that's going to be a theme through a lot of the rest of these cars. It doesn't look like the gauge. I would imagine that gauge to the left there, right under my left hand, is the turbo gauge. Doesn't look like it's working, unfortunately, because it would be really handy to know exactly when the turbo pressure is coming on. But we'll head towards the end of the lap, and I have a feeling I'm going to have to hold on for dear life with this car. It's very darty through the corners, surprisingly so. It turns quite well. But once that power comes in, the rear definitely wants to kick around. So I'll get acclimated to the car and come back to you here in a minute. All right, we'll come and do what I hope can be a somewhat representative lap of what this car can do, but it is such a tricky car to drive. Not unexpected, but it's really all about that turbo lag on throttles. We'll come through the final couple of corners and see if I can control it for at least a lap. Up the gearbox though, up through 5th gear. And we'll come up to cops, and you have to slow down so much for medium or high speed corners, a lot more than you think you would, so we don't jump the curbs. But there we go, on the throttle, rear end wagging out. And we'll get it up to 5th gear for just a second here, into Maggots and Beckett's, down to 3rd. Gentle on the throttles, will come to hanger straight though. So easy to spin the car out there, believe me. And then flat out up to 5th gear. So the RPMs climb, we'll look towards Stowe corner. Down to 3rd gear. Run a bit wide on the entry, very wide on the entry. We'll try to hold it together though. Oversteer the whole way. And now to some of the slower corners, and club here, almost a worst case scenario for this car as I run wide again. Trying to accelerate out of this. Short shift a little bit, but still so much oversteer. And flat out through Abbey, no problem. But you can see the potential lap is so much faster, over 2 seconds, I think, faster than that 49 was. Come to the end of the lap, down to 2nd gear. 7/10 up on my best lap, I think. Even with the mistakes in the middle, run a bit wide there. Through these corners, though, it's almost sedate when you don't have the turbo pressure because there is almost no downforce. It feels like, anyway. Cars hadn't figured out how to get it all back yet, but we'll come to the line. Very, very challenging car to drive, a 34.2. I could do much better than that with a lot of practice, but it would take a long time, I think, to get good at a car like this. Did quite a lot more laps than I was expecting to. I think this might have been lap 12 or 13 that you're seeing here, but so easy to lose control of because of that turbo lag and the fact that the car has so little turn and grip. It's quite easy to run wide on corners, but a very unique experience and so different feeling than the BT49 was. So if there was any doubt that these cars in this pack are different from one another, I think this one very much proves that. So now we go from one absolute handful to probably another, but hopefully a slightly better behaved handful. This is Ayrton Senna's 1986 Lotus 98T. Now you might be thinking, I don't think Senna won the championship in this car, and you'd be right. This is the one car included that isn't a championship winning car, I guess taking the place of Piquet's last championship. But if I can be honest, I think this car is a lot more iconic, and I'd much rather have it than another one of Piquet's cars. Those of you that enjoy Assetto Corsa will be very familiar with this car. It's included over there and is a favorite of a lot of folks to drive. The 98T may have not won the championship, but it did win 2 races with Senna behind the wheel at Spain and Detroit, and otherwise captured 8 podiums on its way to 4th in the championship behind Alain Prost. It's in this car I believe Senna gained his well-deserved attention, and what a car it was. 1200 horsepower in qualifying configuration. It's a turbo lover's dream, and one that I'm very excited to have included in AMS 2. So hoping for something a lot better behaved in the 98T than the BT52, because I don't think I can take that again, and I think it will be. A few years of progress did a lot to help stabilize the cars under some new regulations, and you can see the shape return to a bit more of what we're familiar with today. It was actually fuel consumption that was one of the main issues with this car. As I'll lock up the brakes there, still cold, I'd assume. But it couldn't quite go the distance in a lot of races, having to wind back some of the turbo pressure in the engine really to preserve it. So it could have been a lot more successful than it was, and what a beautiful car it is. So I'll do a few laps here and try to get acclimated to it and see what I can put together. So as expected, the 98T here is a much nicer car to drive and a lot faster too. You can see the potential lap up there already down to a 30 flat, and I've just done a few laps to get acclimated to the car, and it is so much easier than the 52, which is funny because this car is normally one of those tricky cars to drive, and I'm certainly not driving it super fast, but it just behaves a lot more predictably, even with the turbo lag and things. And man, is that turbo powerful. As I'll come to Maggots and Beckett's here. Get down to third gear. Not quite the right lines and things, but second gear here, and we'll accelerate on to the straight. You can see the car, cut the curb a little bit there. The acceleration is unreal in this car. It gives you a great sense of just how powerful it was. Come through Stowe here. Coming out of this corner has been one of the favorites so far. There we go, just on the accelerator, clip the curb just a little bit there. Don't want to do that too much. But absolutely a much more enjoyable driving experience. It would be a lot of work to get fast in a car like this, and you can only imagine just putting everything on the line in a qualifying session with 1,200 horsepower, a special engine essentially in the car. So bottom out, I think, there. Either that's the wastegate or the car bottoming out, and it's quite loud, whatever it is. Let's come through the final corners here. I'm 4/10 up. I'm already down to a 29.7 potential lap. Thankfully, this car does have a working turbo gauge and everything in it. You can see on the right there, bar, the needle that keeps swinging frantically as I'm stabbing at the throttle. Get on the throttle there, just ride the curb just a little bit. Do one more lap around here as the sun in my eyes. Nice autumn day here at Silverstone. Kind of the perfect track for a car like this, I would say. A street track. I definitely want to try this car out around Adelaide. I'm just thinking of all the awesome circuits that AMS2 has in it that all these cars are going to fit really well on. Come up to Stowe again, down to third gear. So much more controlled. I think if you're really going fast in this car, this will jet away again. If you're really going fast in this car, you would be all over the place and sawing at the wheel, but smooth is fast sometimes. Try to accelerate out of club again. A really tricky corner for a turbo car. Any car really, but turbo cars are just the worst through there. Come towards the end of the lap, more of that bottoming out. It's very loud. I imagine that would be quite loud in the car, so maybe it's accurate, but it's alarming either way. So come through the final few corners here. Just a nice car to drive and a great looking car too. One that I know a lot of folks will jump to straight away. The Brabhams are a little bit more obscure for modern audiences. So we come through the final corner here. Not a bad lap overall. 29.4. I think the Brabhams are a bit more obscure. Even the Lotus 72 and the McLaren from Emerson Fittipaldi, those are really old cars at this point, so a bit more obscure. And with the popularity of Senna, though, I think this is where a lot of folks pick up some of their F1 knowledge, and I think will be one a lot of folks jump in. And from what I've driven so far, it behaves like I would expect it to, and is a lot of fun to drive, especially compared to some of the earlier ones. So excited to see what's next, but this is absolutely one I'll be coming back to. So if maybe you're of an age where the 98T is still a little bit obscure to you, no doubt you'll know this car. This is the McLaren MP4, the 1988 McLaren, perhaps the most successful Grand Prix car of all time. It's hard to argue with. It won 15 of the 16 races in 1988. I think both cars for Prost and Senna DNFing at the Italian Grand Prix. And this car, just a couple years after the 98T we just looked at, is such a radically different car, much because the regulations once again had been changed, but also because it was a pioneering design and really shaped what Grand Prix cars would look like going forward. This was one of the first, if not the first, cars designed entirely with carbon fiber for the monocoque. Carbon fiber had been used for quite a while for various parts, but designing something so structurally important and integral to the whole design was a massive challenge and required lots of special engineering and technology and things. Much of the rule changes had come in the engine, specifically the turbos. Gone were the massive turbos of the early and mid-'80s, and turbo size had been restricted quite a bit. So that's where you're seeing quite a lot lower of a car, but I think McLaren took that to the max and made this ultra-low pancake-style car. Senna just edged out Prost for the championship, one of those classic championship seasons that really was just the McLaren show, but what a show it was, and featured very heavily, of course, in the Senna documentary, as it was his first championship. So a great classic car, and one I'm very excited to drive. Wow, so my first thought in sitting in this car is, where is the car? The view that you get from this car is unbelievable, and the exposed nature of the driver, just the little amount of cockpit that's around you, I don't know how to better say it, your shoulders are just sticking out of the car completely. Very much harkens back to Grand Prix cars of the 1950s that were so exposed like this. In the 60s, they really started building up the cockpit, at least the thin aluminum that was around the driver, and we saw in some of the earlier cars too how much cockpit is around you for that aero and everything. But this is minimalism to an extreme. So dangerous by modern standards, but so cool. So cool to experience in a sim. I think this would be a great car for VR or something like that, with the wheels so exposed. Be fun to get around street circuits, and definitely plant those front wheels close to the curbs. And it has a style that's, I guess how I would describe like Star Wars futuristic, where it's that 80s futuristic type tech, the dashboard and everything. But yeah, it's so cool to drive, so cool to look at too. But we'll try to do a few laps here, see if I can get up to some decent speed, and then see how she goes. First things I noticed with driving this car is how much busier you are with the gears. It's a 6-speed, it's still an H pattern, it still has a physical clutch, although I'm sure it's very possible to shift it without using the clutch. They, again, probably would have used it during races to preserve the gearbox when not trying to set ultimate lap times. Call up to cops here though. It is so much more downforce, a better behaved car than anything we've driven up to this point, especially through slower stuff, but also through fast stuff here. This will take the entrance to Maggots there very fast. Second gear through Beckett's. And the lap time reflects that. I'm down to a 29.2 or 3 potential lap, and I'm sure it can go much faster than that. Up to 6th gear down Hanger Straight. Down 2 gears for Stowe, probably go 3. Real pleasure to drive this car, and with the cockpit being so open, just like I said in the intro, a little oversteer there, so it's still lively, but you can place the front wheels exactly where you want them, and I can only imagine that would be enhanced so much with VR or something like that. Just a downshift here under the bridge. Probably could take that flat out actually, feeling the car now. 2nd gear for the end of the lap here. Keep it in 2nd, turn to left foot braking. Just dance the car here through the end of the lap. I think this is where it's going to pick up a lot of its time, because it might be a bit slower in a straight line, or maybe even through acceleration in general. So hit the rev limiter there, 29.1. So we'll do another lap, why not? I think this is a car that I could do a lot of seat time in. I instantly want to take it to all of the tracks, Monaco, Suzuka especially. I think this car would be awesome there with just how flowing that circuit is. Bit slow through the S's, but not going for ultimate pace. Just want to drive the car and get a sense of how it feels. It feels very planted, but it gets a little lively in some of the corners. You can get the rear end out just a little bit. And it doesn't just snap on you like, say, that BT49 would with oversteer. Comfortable coming through club there, and it handles chicanes and things just so much better than some of the earlier cars. We'll try flat out, no problem there. Down down the gears though, all the way to second, clutching the whole way down. A lot of fun to do that. Certainly it would be faster just to use it as a dog box. We'll come through the final few corners. I don't know if this lap will be quicker, but it's every bit as fun. We'll come to the line. There we go, 29.9, so a bit slower, but down to a 28.3 potential lap, and I think you could go a lot quicker than that with just a little bit more practice. A lot easier of a car to drive though, as I said, and just having such an exposed cockpit is a really unique experience, because from here, things do get a bit more closed up, although not quite like we have it these days, but truly a product of its time, both in the aesthetics as well as the driving experience, and might be the pinnacle of the manual Formula One before things really started to get into serious electronics and things. But absolutely a joy to drive. Just like the 98 T, I'll be coming back to this one quite a many times. And now we get to the final two of the 6 vehicles. I think I said 5 earlier, but the final 2, and I'm interested to try these out because on the surface they seem very similar, but they're very much not and have a lot of interesting details about them, and so hopefully AMS2 can bring that out. But the first of the 2 is the 1989 and 1990 Challenger from McLaren, the MP4-5, and this is specifically the 90 version in which Senna won his second championship. In 1989, F1 was back to naturally aspirated engines. We have the overhead air intakes. So away with the turbos, but an increase generally across the board for the number of cylinders. This car was powered by a V10 Honda engine that output about 700 horsepower. So overall, the engineers were able to come out with roughly the same amount of horsepower between the turbocharged and the non-turbocharged engines. But it brought us to some of the fantastic and memorable music that played as these cars drove by. This car itself is very famous for that onboard lap with Senna at Monaco, dancing in and out of slower cars as he does his qualifying lap. And of course, the famous opening lap crash at Suzuka as Prost and him went head-to-head into the first corner, and we all know what happened from there. Winning 6 races in both 1989 and 1990, the MP4-5 was a very successful car, but just edged out the championship over Ferrari, who were their main rivals in this period. A fantastic era in Formula One, and really when I first became interested in the sport. So how different was Formula One with naturally aspirated engines? Well, hopefully, let's find out. So a very different looking and sounding view from the cockpit here. Unfortunately, the rev counter, and I saw this noted on the forums, but I think the steering wheel has to be in the wrong position because from the driving view, you can't quite see the rev counter while the steering wheel's active, which is a shame. But otherwise, really interesting windscreen, I guess you'd call it, or aero device on the cockpit. But perhaps the most interesting thing has to be the engine note here. So I'll properly rev it out in a couple of minutes, but you can see that the car overall feels a little bit more closed in, but certainly speedy, and I'm excited to see just how much faster, or if this car is actually faster than the MP4-4, at least in my little driving around here, but it certainly feels quite a bit different even from the first few corners. So I'll get decent at driving the car and I'll come back and we'll see what it's all about. So we'll come to start a lap in the 4.5, and my assumption was correct. There's nothing massively different about driving this car than driving the 4.4, but it does everything just a little bit better than the 4.4 did. You can go just that little bit faster into every corner, and you have the great soundtrack behind you the whole time. So we'll come into cops here, down 2 gears, just try not to jump on any of the curbs. To 6th gear, and we'll actually be flat out into Maggots and Beckett's. Just a little bit of a lift there, down a couple of gears, do a lot of shifting in the corners, dancing on the pedals. I tried to shift this without the clutch, and I'm not sure how it's modeled in AMS2 or if it's correct as I hit the top of the rev range there just a little bit, but up to 6th gear, down hanger straight, with down 3 gears here for stow. But I could not dog box the car as I thought you'd be able to with something like this. You do have to rev match, and I could get it to pop into some gears, but either a lot more practice is needed to properly rev match, or something's a little funny with the clutch. So I'm using heel and toe here, which I think you may do in this car during a long race just to preserve things, but certainly on a qualifying lap you would left foot brake and hammer through the gears, or at least I'd think. I'm sure folks in the comments will know. Rifle down the gearbox. It's very satisfying. Missed the apex there, but right on the throttle again. Catch the kick sideways. Dance the car just a little bit. It's very lively. That's maybe a bit different than the 4.4. That seemed a bit more planted or heavier overall, despite it being such a light Grand Prix car. Trying to hit the top of the rev range, but we'll come across the line and massively quicker. 127.5. My optimal's way down there in the 26s. And perhaps the 4.4 could be a bit faster if I take the time and properly learn how to drive it, but taking just about the same amount of time in all these cars, and the 4.5 here immediately just feels natural on the hands. And as somebody that doesn't always drive this type of car, it's quite easy to jump into and at least put together laps. Maybe not quick ones, but decent laps, clean laps, and have generally a lot of fun driving it. So overall, this car, I'll back off a little bit, very fun to drive. I think a bit more fun actually, at least in first impressions and in maybe 10 laps that I've done with it. More fun than the 4.4, just overall is a little easier, but the view itself, not quite as good, not quite as raw maybe as the 4.4 is, and so that one might take the cake a little bit more than this to me. But the soundtrack for this, that V10 engine Honda is very good, and it's only promised to get a bit better with the next one. So lastly, and certainly not least, we get to the 1991 challenger from McLaren, the MP4-6. This car was utterly dominant at the start of the season. It won the first 4 rounds in a row, most prominently in Brazil with Senna, famously holding the flag above his head as he does the parade lap, or victory lap, after he won. A very iconic car, and instantly what comes to my mind when I think of Senna. In total, the car won 7 times during the 91 season and ended up having some challenge from Williams and Mansell later in the year, but came back to win a few more, including the final 2 rounds with Senna winning one and Berger actually winning the other. This fantastic car was powered by a Honda V12 and is said to be one of the best sounding Formula One engines of all time. So I definitely want to hear what Reiza have in store for us with this one. Well, it's getting towards evening now here at Silverstone, and kind of return to this more open cockpit feeling. It's a really pretty car from inside and out. Perfect looking car in my opinion. I think a lot of your opinions of what things look good and how things should be come from when you first became interested in something. And so it fits that this is around the time that I look at a car and say that looks pretty good, but it has to look pretty good. Hopefully to some newer eyes or some older eyes that haven't seen it before, it does look pretty good as we drive into the sunset here. But this is from when F1 cars looked a little bit like go-karts, and AMS2 has had a set of cars to fit this time period for quite a while in the sim. I did some videos on them in the past, and so I'm quite eager to see how this one fits in, because this is one of the sets of cars outside of the 70s and 60s cars that I drive the most when I'm booting up AMS2. So quite familiar with the type overall, and interested to see how this one compares. What an absolute pleasure this car is to drive. It doesn't feel altogether that different from the last couple cars, MP4, MP5. Naturally, the MP6 is going to be just an evolution of that. But it just feels that little bit better, just like the MP4, or just like the MP5 did over the 4. It does everything just a little bit nicer and really completes the whole experience of this era of Formula One. Done a couple of gears here, really push the car into Maggots and Beckett's, just nip the curb there. Fully facing the setting sun as we come onto hanger straight here up to 6th gear. And flat out to the sound. That Honda V12. I'll be honest, I think I like the V10 a little bit more. It might just be the sample of the audio here. This doesn't sound quite as impactful coming from the V10. It's still a nice noise though, and I'm sure some will prefer it. Still using the clutch, and so one thing I'm gonna have to read up on is when they stopped using clutch with shifting. I can't get the car to behave quite right shifting without it. Makes it a little extra challenging, but fun too, to fly through the gears on the downshifts. I know around this time Williams was coming out with their paddle shifters, and certainly wouldn't have had to use the clutch for those. But all 6 gears here come across the line. It's 125.7, right about on pace with the final couple of cars. I'm sure we can squeak out a little bit more time. We'll go for another hard lap here. Up to 6th gear. Flat here through the start of Maggots and Beckett's. Down 2 gears. Ran a bit wide there. Hold it nice and tight. Just nip the curb. And accelerate away onto Hanger Straight. The car a little bit on exit, accelerate just for a short time here, then the hard braking for club, 2nd gear. Right up onto the curb, you wouldn't want to do that, but try to get the accelerator down. A bit easier in these cars than some of the earlier ones, but still such a challenging corner. Fly through Abbey, no chicane in this version, and then flat out through this right-hander. Bottoming out the whole way, still kind of an awkward sound effect. Lock their left front. So coming to the final sequence of bends. A little bit of a scrappy lap here, but not altogether too bad. And such a fun car, very iconic car, and a great car to have in AMS2. Come to the line. 125.4. Not sure how fast that is compared to the MP4-5, but lap time, not the ultimate goal today. Just experiencing these cars, and this car is an experience. I think out of the more modern set of them, I guess, the McLarens from the MP4 on, I like this one the most, and a lot of it has to do with just the time period it came from. 1991 being a year where really became interested in Formula One, but it's a fantastic car, a fantastic story, and a fun thing to drive in AMS2, as all of these are. So nothing stands out that makes the MP4-6 drive dramatically different from the 5 or even the 4, to be honest, but it's just a bit better in every way and makes it a really fun drive. It handles just a lot better, even on the default setup, and does what you want it to. And overall, these cars and this whole Brazilian Racing Legends, I'm very impressed with how they feel. They drive very nice, and AMS2 has had a lot of issues in the past with physics and certainly frustrating experiences driving some of the cars, and outside of a couple things here and there, I think these all drive quite nice. I've driven this type of car, and there are some very nice mods for especially the early 90s cars available in R-Factor 2 and older R-Factor games, AMS1. Of course, Assetto Corsa has a bunch of stuff, and I think these, genuinely, I think these feel along the same lines as those. The cars don't handle in such a different way that you would feel foreign to them. Has a bit of that AMS2 feel, but I don't think that's such a bad word anymore as it may have been a couple of years ago. I'll say I'm a little disappointed in the overall visual appearance of some of the cars. I think the 98T looks just a little too overweight, if we say it that way. But the other cars seem modeled generally nice. The drivers always look a little odd in them, but they're getting better with the helmets and things like that. Of course, there will be skin packs and all of that to brush up the liveries, but you may have noticed in this video a lot of the replays, the cars are jittery or shimmering. There's a lot of Z-fighting on the textures, and I've not noticed that with other cars in AMS2, so I don't know what is going on with this set of cars that it has that type of effect to it. Might have been the way that they applied the different textures on them. But I was just recording some videos and things of other cars and did not have the same issues. So it seems to be specific to the set, which is unfortunate. It makes it feel not quite as premium, I guess, as it really should be, being a first-party product. But no doubt some of these things will be ironed out over the coming days, as always is the case with AMS2. It's been constant improvement. It's really a good and a bad thing. There's always something new coming, always a new patch, something being fixed. Reiza absolutely pay a lot of attention to what folks report to them and fix all of these issues. But I do find myself always kind of waiting with AMS2. I've got a bunch of ideas for things I'd love to record videos for, like Indy cars at Indianapolis or some older Formula cars, but I'm always waiting for one fix or one change that should be coming at some point but isn't quite here yet. I guess that's the way things are with a sim that's constantly being developed, and we have to be thankful that they're continuing to come out with new things like this, because I do think this is a nice pack and adds a lot to the sim. If you like 80s and 90s Formula One, you absolutely have to check this out. I know these cars exist in other sims and quite nice versions of them, but I come back to AMS2 quite often when I just want to sit down and drive, and I don't know exactly what it is. It could be as simple as just the graphics are nice, but it's the selection of tracks and cars and how easy it is to get up and running with it that just makes it a very attractive sim compared to some of the other things that are out there. So with that being said, I will no doubt be back at some point with some of these cars. Let me know which one you think is your favorite. Maybe I'll focus in on that one and put together a nice little race. I do want to do a full-length race at some point in AMS2 just to see if I can pull it off with cars pitting and going the distance and all that. So maybe one of these cars would be a good one to do that in. But until then, I hope you enjoyed this quick look at all these cars. So until the next thing, thank you for watching. This is GP Laps, and I'll see you all again next time.